here we are. That's not the first, is that the first
No,
slide?
sorry.
No.
Okay. I'm very sorry, I apologize for my husband. He always speaks too much. In answer to Roger, which I'm extremely pleased to be here with, because I was not with you in 2016 when Roger was participated, so I didn't have the chance to hear him before, but now I do. And also, before I start, I would like to say how pleased I am to be with you today. For me, it's always a great joy, a great honor. And in that, I would like to thank Alberto, of course, Claudio, and all of you here for always being so kind to me. So what I want to say, and I know I gave the translation to the translators, but before I start, I want to reassure Roger and tell him that, in a way, the EU is already dead. And I'm going to explain why. The subject that our organizer had given me today is the one of the European Union. Of course, it's a topic that we are all extremely familiar with. We are very familiar with it because we did a lot of work on it. First, with Alberto here, there's this working paper, and we are on very familiar ground. And of course, I want to reassure you today to tell you that, and I have Alberto anyway to do it, I'm not going to go through great simulation. I'm not going to go through great mathematical development. I don't feel like it, and I'm not sure it will be very useful to you. But instead, what I really would like to talk about is really the origin of the EU, the origin of the euro. Why are we in the mess we are in? And I have a very simple explanation, which I have developed here in this book that has been published in April 2021. And of course, the fault is the fault of the French. Yeah. So let me explain. It is France, or rather the culture and ambition of the technocratic oligarchy that control France. I'm sure you remember those two people here. One is called François Mitterrand, and the other one, Jacques Delors. So let us recall the story. Europe Economic and Monetary Union was instigated in the run-up to the reunification of Germany in 1989 by the holders of state power in France, François Mitterrand and his entourage, notably here Jacques Delors, his former finance minister, who by that time had become president of the European Commission. Their aim of protecting and simultaneously projecting French power was rationalized as the ineffable manifest destiny of France and Europe, or rather, should I say, France as Europe. Here, made reality was the assumption of the French government elite, governing elite, that their own gratification must represent the general will, according to Rousseau Jean-Jacques Rousseau formula for recovering primitive human virtue. Since inspiring the revolutionary terrorists of the 1790s, this concept of the general will, incarnated in the ruling group, labeling itself according to taste, for example, Lenin's self-portrait of the Bolshevik as the vanguard of the proletariat, has boiled down to an update in the garb of the Enlightenment of Louis XIV's dictum, l'État, c'est moi. Of course, the Mitterrand gang had not invented the idea of a European monetary union out of the blue. The idea had been extensively discussed by the adepts of the European movement that emerged after World War II. If you remember, as early as 1947, you had people like Maurice Allais, a French economist who later won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics, already envisaged the introduction of a single European currency, but only if it was preceded by a political union. Jacques Rueff, as well, the economist and civil servant who advised de Gaulle, shared with de Gaulle a fear of inflation and a vision of France remaining the political leader of Europe with a single currency, which would eventually come to rival the US dollar, of course. And that was part of their constant quest for exchange rate stability in the spirit of the discipline and certainty of the gold standard to ensure the smooth functioning of the common market. For that, you have to note the key features of that early thinking. First one, the need for a proper political union to precede any monetary union, and the revealing preference for the gold standard. And I come back to both this point. Now, what you have to keep in mind is that all those early ideas would not have advanced much beyond the turbulent experiments of exchange rate management, snakes and pegs that we have seen in the 70s and the 80s, if it had not been for the opportunity of leverage that German reunification offered to Mitterrand to harness the economic and monetary power of Germany to French ambitions. It was such an opportunity for Mitterrand. The fall of the Berlin Wall turned out to be the kind of ambition that the Élysée never envisaged before. If you remember, the first 2 years of the Mitterrand presidency was a complete fiasco. That was from 1981 to 1983, is when Mitterrand thought he could have the Soviet Union in France. Well, in France we had the Soviet Union, but not in the form that he wanted. And during that time, the financial market forced him to halt his experiments in a planned economy. But that experience convinced the Parisian technocrats that sovereignty for which they had been trained no longer existed, at least in the monetary sphere. And in turn, this helped to reinforce the idea of a European solution. And they started to have this idea that they just could hijack the European Union and capture the German, basically the German central bank. So here you can find the political motive behind the French drive for a monetary union with Germany. Essentially, it was to take a formal share in what had been until then the Bundesbank de facto controlling influence over the monetary policy of France. And this control was very much resented by the French elite. Suddenly, they could reverse this trend. The summary of this story is that the genesis of the euro is a very powerful demonstration of the toxic combination of utopian delusions and cynical realpolitik. Mitterrand wanted a shared currency with Germany to benefit from Germany's superior monetary stability under the stewardship of the Bundesbank, while also gaining a decisive French handle on the Bundesbank in response to the French proposal for a monetary union along the lines we see today. Helmut Kohl, at the time, insisted that the euro would require a political union to work. This was blocked by Mitterrand, who insisted on the current unworkable hybrid arrangement that has hampered possible domestic change, both in France and the other unfortunate denizens of the Eurozone. This episode exposed a pernicious underlying assumption of the French governing elite, which, to answer Roger in terms of incompetence, have nothing to envy to the British government. I think they can have a nice championship on this one. Okay. The first thing that had to be banned was the political will of the French rulers. It was the French electorate. But the French sometimes are not very easy. They can be hard to persuade. And the chief exhibit here is the September 1992 referendum on whether to ratify the Maastricht Treaty. The French voted yes, but by such a narrow margin, 51 to 49%, that many had in fact wondered if the hand of, sorry for my Fiorentini friends, but we call Mitterrand the Fiorentine, le Florentin. He referred to the Machiavellis. Rested, and we were all wondering whether he had somehow managed to interfere with the result of this referendum. But regardless of whether there was actual vote rigging, the propaganda effort is very revealing of this slender public endorsement of the single currency. For in the run-up to that referendum, the media and the political class launched a vigorous publicity campaign in favor of the proposed single currency. Their propaganda included such evocative slogans such as Maastricht is the Treaty of Versailles without a war. And this whole episode already put on display 4 core realities about the monetary union that have persisted ever since. First, France will never accept a full-blooded federal Europe transcending the nation-state. It will tolerate closer integration only so long as fundamental French national interests remain unchallenged. Second, the voting public has no right to object to the order willed by their leaders. This is a result of the French referendum vote of 2005 against the European Constitution. That document became later the Treaty of Lisbon, without any consultation with the French people, of course. So you had a serial rejection by voters of establishment governing parties in France, Italy, and most other EU member states, except Germany. Third, above all, this ruling technocratic class of France, which I see as a grave digger of democracy, even as it thinks of itself as the arbiter of the nation's destiny, has, let's say, permeated European institution and practice. All the bureaucrats of which Roger talked about, their origin is really the French administration system. And they have acted like a virus. They have basically contaminated all the international institutions in a very effective way. Fourth, the monetary union is a compact between France and Germany, and is all about accommodating the aspirations, ambitions, and complexes of those two pivotal players. And I would like to devote the rest of my little historical survey to recalling how this fourth and last point about the Franco-German compact has played out. For this purpose, let us once again remember the starting point. Germany went along, despite its misgiving with the French project for a monetary union of fiscal sovereigns. Germany did so because it projects its national ambition onto the constructions of Europe. But also Germany will not block the plan of its core French partner to frame a monetary union to project French power. Germany would also not adjust its economic management to the monetary union. When Germany essentially diverged, grabbing a competitive advantage, the result is payment imbalances. In the mind of the designer of the EMU, current account balances would cease to matter after the introduction of the single currency, and balance of payment crises were ruled out. This has been developed many times by Alberto in various scientific papers, such as in his International Review of Applied Economics in 2015, in which he has shown that countries like Italy, caught in a monetary union trap of inferior competitiveness, will descend into a downward spiral of decline in productivity and living standards. 5 years after Alberto has published in his paper, the OECD has released data showing that disposable income per adult in Italy had declined in real terms by the end of the first 2 decades of the existence of the euro. This is a shocking and scandalous outcome. And the result of Germany's competitiveness, you can see it in this slide, is an entrenched current account surplus. It averaged about 6% of GDP every year since 2004. This anti-social reliance on other countries' demand, above the whole demand in its fellow euro member, should have been corrected by the European Union macroeconomic imbalance procedure. Meanwhile, The loss of competitiveness in France resulted, of course, in higher than ever offsetting budget deficits. And France should have been forced to correct this situation under the agreed terms of the various iterations of the Stability and Growth Pact. No need to say that nothing happened on either front. The macroeconomic imbalances procedure has never, ever been invoked against Germany. As for France, he has never been prevented from running the budget deficit that he wanted to. France was sometimes included by the European Commission into its so-called excessive deficit procedures, but never any sanction was ever brought against the country. In short, France and Germany have always got away with everything. The irony for France, which has always dreamt of the euro rivaling or even supplanting the so-called exorbitant privilege of the US dollar as a world reserve currency, is that France has in effect enjoyed precisely that exorbitant privilege in the European Monetary Union. And the reason for this situation is political. Any sanction on France or Germany would risk destroying French and German political consent for the euro. Here we have a club whose initial rules were set according to the collective memory and economic structure of the club core members, Germany and France. But the core members are above the law. This political reality works to the detriment of the members of the Eurozone that, like Italy, are caught in a cycle of inferior competitiveness. So what are the right lessons to be drawn from this experience? The right lesson to be drawn is that there is no solution, as the only way that the euro could survive would be to restore credibility to the Eurozone fiscal rules and the macroeconomic imbalance procedure by applying these rules to all without exception. If all members of the Monetary Union wanted to introduce greater flexibility to these rules, this should be clearly written down. If Germany and other countries of similar mind, like Austria and the Netherlands, do not like this, then they could form their own monetary union, as suggested by our friends Stefan Kavalek, Kamil Kaminski, and Ernest Pritaciuk. Those authors suggest that Germany and other surplus countries should be the first to leave the euro. And at this stage, of course, the French government would be confronted and pulled between its Europeanist ideology and its economic reality of facing severe constraints such as chronic unemployment, deindustrialization, high level of corporate and public debt. Having touched on what to do, I would like to end by suggesting how to do it. By this, I mean that the role of intellectuals is to be critical, is not to be slaves to the prevalent political nostrums on any topic, whether that is geopolitics, monetary unions, migration, or the welfare state. Free expressions becomes particularly sensitive in covering international affairs, especially where governments have become engaged in any kind of geopolitical competitions or contest with inevitable and always hypersensitive military overtones. Public criticism of government policy is widely perceived and sometimes openly denounced as treacherous, and the media often turns in this situation towards self-censorship. While there is a problem for all democratic countries, European propaganda is particularly pernicious when backed up by so-called public intellectuals, or what I would prefer to call the preaching clergy of the establishment. Questioning the euro viability or its cost is considered heresy, which is dismissed with the retort that any country daring to leave the monetary union would face apocalyptic economic cost. The proponents of returning to a national currency are vilified as being nationalist or worse still, populist. For Thomas Piketty, populism is a term that is used by elite to disqualify political movement over which they lack enough control. And is certainly a view that shares Emmanuel Macron, the current president of France. When he endorsed in June 2018, he declared, referring to the election success in Italy of the Lega and the Movimento 5 Stelle, he said, you can see populists popping up a bit like leprosy all across Europe, in countries where we thought that it would be impossible to see them again in neighboring countries. My question to him was always, who does he think he is? I will end by quoting from a column in La Voce in May 2017 by an Italian economist called Roberto Perotti. This was written in reaction to a letter. The letter was signed by 25 Nobel Prize winning economists, and it was published by a newspaper called Le Monde. The signatories aimed their fire at Marine Le Pen, the nationalist opponent of Macron, in the then imminent French presidential election runoff. They objected to Le Pen, citing some of their work in support of her Eurosceptic platform, which included a commitment to leave the Eurozone. Perotti stressed that the principle of authority, in this case, the signatory status as Nobel laureate, is never a convincing argument to close a debate. In particular, he stated that economists like to boast of being hardwired to debunk. So since when did the authority principle all sway among them? This situation, indeed, is starting to look like a small-scale version of the Protestant Reformation. For all the fire and fury of their pronouncement, anathema, excommunication, and for all their academic titles and ecclesiastical benefits, the stochastic found themselves swept away by Luther and Calvin. And I'm quite sure that soon the same will apply to the euro and to the French technocracy. Thank you.